brasileira da Universidade de Cambridge, a CUBS, em colaboração com a comunidade da Faculdade de Educação de Cambridge,
the Education University of Cambridge,
e movimentos sociais do Brasil.
and with many collectives and social organizations in Brazil. My name is Juliana Estadoto. I have just finished my degree in education, and I am part of the Cambridge Educational Organization. For today's debate table, I have the support of Regiane Ferreira, who is graduating in pedagogy in Instituto Singularidade, and she is focused on adult education.
Que vocês façam as suas perguntas no
We are asking you to please make your questions on the place available here on Zoom, and please write who the person you are asking the questions to, one of the panelists. And if you are taking part in this event for a certificate, please do leave your name here in the chats. So today I will start with today's debate, and it is popular education, youth and adult education based on Paulo Freire's ideas. The panel will address the importance of popular education and the contributions of Paulo Freire in confronting illiteracy and social inequalities in Brazil. We have the panelist Sonia Couto talking about political-pedagogical practices in CIEJA, the adult education, dialogues with Freire's principles. We will also have Diego Elias, who will talk about Paulo Freire's approach in the Black community and the poor community as well. And lastly, Franciele Busico Lima, who will bring the experience of education as a liberating experience. So to start off, so just to remind us, we will have 3 people speaking, and then you may ask questions. So I will start off by inviting Sonia Couto, who is a master from USP University. She used to work for the City Council schools. She has a PhD degree in education. And she is the author of the book Paulo Freire Method, Reinventing and a Legacy in Brasilia. She is also an author of several textbooks developed for adult education from Freire's perspective. And her mission is to socialize and continue the legacy of Paulo Freire. She is the coordinator of the Paulo Freire Reference Center. So Sonia, please with you.
Very much, everyone, and I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me tonight to this collective, and especially thank you to Cambridge. And it's a privilege to be able to dialogue with you guys about Paulo Freire. It's a real pleasure. This year, for which we're commemorating the 100 years of Paulo Freire, is a wonderful opportunity which has given us much happiness. We are honoring Paulo Freire with this and his legacy. And how do we honor his legacy? We need to reflect on his ideas, think about how we bring them to our practices in everyday life. And with this, we're reinventing what Paulo Freire wanted. He wanted opportunity for everyone. The first time I came across his ideas, the professor showed me, oriented me how to speak through the method of Paulo Freire, and he always questioned methods of teaching, and it's very important to do so. But I don't want you to reproduce what I'm saying. I want you to reinvent what I am saying, because that's what's important. it's responsible, it's important to think about his principles, his ideas, how to apply them in whatever context, because all the contexts are different. So it's very important. This year, we're very happy to talk about Paulo Freire because his centenary brought light to his work in a moment where currently Brazil is being demonized. It's a really important moment. Now in September, our social networks are being inundated by messages, texts, videos, by people who have the opportunity to get to know Paulo Freire. And so lots of people with all this knowledge, we are able to hope in fact and in the law that he can bring new things today to Brazilian education. So we're talking about the education of youths and adults. It's really important to speak about the education of youths and adults in a state context, but also to do a historical voyage in order to understand from where these practices of critical pedagogy came from. They're more qualified. We have a history that is really linked to the background. So we really need to supersede this misjudged perception of education that historically has been true in Brazil. And we need to think about things that aren't ideal in the current situation today. CIEJA, which is the education of youths and adults, is important to amplify in all the contexts. It's an education which doesn't lack a politics, inclusion of many people. To be inserted into an educational policy. We need to understand why this vision was structured and built. So we're going to look back a little bit in time and think about how this was built back in time in Brazil, a country that was colonized and exploited, has the remnants of this in our minds. We have colonized minds in Brazil, and the richness of our culture, the richness of our history has valued different practices that don't go back to our cultural identity. And so the education for adults is very precarious. A lot of the time they don't receive an education, but the education they receive has an emphasis on behavior and a colonial economy. It's an extremely opportunist education. It's not the education with an objective promoting autonomy and independence of the subject, which stems from colonial times. None of the educations focusing on literature and literacy are about the existential nature of these subjects. From 1808 until the Declaration of Independence, nothing happened that helped the education of the masses in Brazil. Only the elite had access to education. It was a very elitist institution. In the 19th century, the government took on responsibility for the education of the poor in various provinces, and those government programs that wanted to offer education, they didn't have the proper resources from the central governments. It was very provincial. But even like this, the same subalterns, the blacks, the slaves, and the women were excluded from this education. So the education of adults at this time and the education that we see now has slowly emerged and being conquered. So first of all, it was just for the rich, and then it was for the poor, but only certain sections of the poor. And in the second half of the 19th century, some of the blacks were able to study. These were called blacks of gain, who were studying and were studying in order to be able to earn money for their masters. So they received an education, but it was a very basic literacy. It was the very, very minimum, basically only able to sign their name, and it was for the benefit of their masters. In the 20th century, there begins this idea of analphabetism, a lack of literacy, and it's a shame for Brazil. It's a backwards, counter-modern idea permeates. And so the country begins to educate these people, not because these people deserve it and have the right, but because it's a modernist movement in order to cleanse the country of illiteracy, to eradicate illiteracy. So Paulo Freire used to get very angry at this kind of attitude. He says illiteracy isn't a cancer, it's not an illness. It's really important that these people have the right to education. They have an intrinsic right to education. We need to create through this a social transformation.
I'm going to run a
So
little
I've
bit
already
because
spoken
I've
for 8
been
minutes, so I'm
talking
going
for about 8
to
minutes.
hurry things up a bit. So,
and so throughout the 20th century, the government started to take care of adult education and have resources for it, especially money for it. It was targeted towards children, so they were very childlike lessons for adults. But only around the 70s, Paulo Freire, who had shown his proposition for education, started to think about education as something that needs to overcome this social condition that is of how education is seen. So Paulo Freire arrives in 1963 in Rio Grande do Norte, in the north of the country. And as his experience there had been so good, he built his system of Paulo Freire, and he was invited to coordinate the National Program of Education. This program sought to make educating adults as something national, but it was stopped by the military coup during our military dictatorship period. And so 80 days after it began, the project was extinct because of the military dictatorship. And so Brazil enters this long period, a dark period in relationship to education. So what was Paulo Freire's experience? He managed to teach adults how to read and write in a question of a few weeks. He used a textbook. He did not use textbook materials. He used words that connected to the subject's ideal of reality and what they understand of the world. So the written code, learning how to read and write, it would work with the awareness of how the reality and words work together. So until the beginning of the 21st century, Brazil worked and still works with adult education as a campaign, as a movement. It's not a consolidated public policy. It's always being introduced. So nowadays, adult education is a fixed modality within public policy, and it takes in the same forms as other areas of education. It should be as important as other areas of education. So adult education has a specificity. It requires practices that are significant to the learner. So we're going to look at some of these most important principles. The first, recognizing the importance of the learner, because they know a lot about life. And they do know a lot, but they don't know that they do know. It only validates the school knowledge, but actually they do have a lot of knowledge. And so all of the knowledge that they have accumulated throughout life is not being valued within the school, but the school does have an important part to make a conversation between this, between school or academic knowledge and the knowledge that these students bring in from their reality. The school doesn't know about these adults, the things that they have done in their life, that they have a family. But the school also has knowledge that should intertwine both of these experiences to create a significant educational experience. So we need to educate and work in the perspective of social inclusion, emancipation. It's important to establish an ideological representation, respect the narratives of these students, their rights to talk, to contribute and question. So the lesson cannot be a monologue from the teacher. It has to be a dialogue between both knowledge, both knowledges that people bring, the school and the student. And education is a political act. This was a big difference that Paulo Freire's ideology brought into education. The idea of education needs to be overcome. It has to be transformative, an education that questions. So how do we educate with Paulo Freire's principles? So in his book, he talks a lot about the limits of education. He says that there is a political control over education, that the dominating class obscures certain perspectives. The center of power is far away from the classroom. So why do we have to work with Paulo Freire today? Because his theory of knowledge makes it very explicit the power relationship inside of education. So he is very current. He still talks about injustice, oppression, fascism, and inequality. So we have to reconnect Paulo Freire's methodology to the classroom. Paulo Freire is not present within the government's building, for instance. His statue is on the other side of the Ministry of Education, Education's building. So we don't have Paulo Freire schools. We have educators who believe in his ideology. He is not exactly present inside the government or even inside the classroom. His ideas do not die. His ideas have traveled frontiers, have traveled through time. So what we are doing now, right here, we are honoring his legacy, and we are also traveling through frontiers and barriers. We are having a dialogue with people from all over the world. And this conversation through Paulo Freire allows us to reach other territories. It doesn't matter where we are speaking from in the world. And we need Paulo Freire because we need the world to be a little bit less hard to love. And this is urgent to Paulo Freire. Another kind of education is necessary. So education has to value human rights, equality, combats oppression. We need an education who will value diversity and all the different kinds of knowledge that people bring, and an education that is critical, who is thinking, who is scientific, who is anti-racist, who is pro-ethics. So through all of this, we find Paulo Freire, who didn't elaborate a method, but an ideology of education. And this education has to be centered on people and their culture, respecting the way that they live, their identity. When people talk about how he created a method, he didn't really go against it anymore, but he never said that he came up with a method. He wanted people to understand that it wasn't a method of teaching, but really a method of learning and understanding. It's centered on the students. And this does connect to other thinkers and other educators as well, who brought constructivism, who brought the idea of building knowledge together. And so to start heading towards the end, there is a key idea of Paulo Freire's idea. The first is the idea of politics. Where does politics come in? And what's perspective? Once Paulo Freire working with a couple of students, they talked about the things that they create through their work. They come up with things, they make things that are consumed by people, right? They were the producers. So he said, you produce things that you don't even have the rights to acquire. So sometimes they would make objects that they wouldn't even have access to buy after. So why? Why do you make things and you can't even acquire it? You don't have the rights to acquire it. And they would say, oh, teachers, because we are poor. And he asked, why are you poor? He would always ask and question. And they said, I am poor because that's what God wants. And so in Pedagogy of Hope, Paulo Freire speak about how can you deconstruct this idea that is God who made you this way. So the idea is that if I am born poor, I must be poor. It is from God. So how do we deconstruct this idea? So he would ask, do you have children? And so they would start talking about their children. And they said, don't you work very hard to give everything to your children? And they said that they never deprive their children of anything. They always try to help them out, right? So this problem that he would bring through questioning, questioning their reality that was given to them, made them
vontade divina, mas de sistema
and then they
social.
understood that poverty wasn't a divine desire. And in these learning textbooks, they taught phrases that were just phrases to teach literacy. And so there's a very famous passage, but Paulo Freire was working with words that were creative words, words that were important to the context of these workers. And you know, these traditional textbooks are there But there's a classic phrase which is Mary, the equivalent of Mary had a little lamb. And what Paulo Freire says is it's important to understand Mary's social context and her position, how the lamb is produced, and who benefits from the lamb. So it's really important for the education of illiteracy to conscientize the workers. Another really important category of Paulo Freire is the dialogue. It was through dialogue that he educated, through the circuit of culture. Yeah, so everyone would sit in a circle, but it's not just that. It's about the opportunity to dialogue between the teacher and the professor, to be able to reflect together collectively. He also created new situations, culture in the classroom. Teaching, not the verb taught, which is closed, but the continuous form of the verb teaching, which means educating over a lifetime. It's not a closed process, it's continuous. Another principal concept of Paulo Freire was banking education, where you deposit education. There is this logic of like putting the education in and banking it and then taking it out. And that's what a lot of educators do. They come with this mentality where, you know, in the hour of your exam, you have this idea of bringing out the information that you have banked. And I'm coming to the end of my talk, so I'm running out of time. So thinking about the level of communication, I think it's really important for you guys to look for yourselves based on these ideas that I brought to the table. And what Paulo Freire said is that the role of the educator isn't to fill the student with knowledge, but to proportion a relationship of dialogue between the educator and the educatee, the learner. The best philosophy student isn't the person who talks about Heraclitus and talks about the issues of being in Plato and looking at all the other Greek philosophers in their extensive terminologies. It's important. And also talking about Hegel and Marx. Important thing for a good philosophy student is to think critically about all the philosophy that he learns and to run the risk of thinking, really reflecting, and to really engage in transformative thinking. When we approach education as thinkers, we are able to develop our own reflections, our own self-awareness. And Paulo Freire had this epistemological circle where you could sit there and ask him, Paulo, what's this? What's going this? And he would never reply what that thing was. He would dialogue around the concept, and he would trace a journey where through the dialogue, we collectively constructed a meaning for the question that you asked. And so it was a collective mission where we arrived at the answer to the question before he replied. In other words, the construction of our thinking comes from the act of thinking. To conclude, Paulo Freire contributed hugely to the education systems of the entire world. In many countries, many proofs of this. And now in this moment, in this seminar, in this panel, bringing Paulo Freire in, we need to think about bringing Paulo Freire into our everyday lives. So I'm going to conclude my speech with a phrase of his. Paulo Freire says, I'm not going to add my voice to the voices of those who are looking for justice and those who are calling, because my voice is independent, it's different. And I am going to bring my own voice to the table and think about the independence of every single person and the uniqueness of their voice that looks for rights. And he concludes by saying, I'm going to bring my voice in with the voices of all those who are looking for liberation, focusing on problematizing our critical thinking and building a better society. I'd like to thank everyone for listening to me, and I look forward to be able to continue our dialogue later on. I'll pass you on now until for the other presenters. Thank you very much, Sonia. It's a real pleasure to hear you speak. Which was very important. So now we're going to continue with Diego. Diego is a Black man born and raised in São Paulo, in the southern neighborhood of São Paulo. He's a professor. He is doing his doctorate in geography at the University of São Paulo, principally looking at the education of youth and adults. And he is working in the school CIEJA, and the title of his talk is Paulo Freire, the impact on the poor, the Blacks, and those who are in the peripheries. Hi guys, pleasure to see you all. Good afternoon to everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be here to celebrate the 100 years of Paulo Freire. We are sewing together many different ideas. Many ideas are being brought to the table, and we're sharing so much, sharing resources, and a real dialogue is incredibly important. I'd like to share with you a little bit about my story. I was born and raised here in Capo Redondo in São Paulo. I'm 37 years old, and I've studied public sciences, public policies, and all of this cultural repertory is really important. I'm the son of a Baianian woman from Bahia who struggled in the 70s, and they came to São Paulo to look for work and to look to raise a family. My father studied until the 4th year, and my mother only until the 5th. My father completed the basic education when he was 50 years old, and my mother, she even started the first year of secondary education. Then she suffered an accident, and so wasn't able to continue. So I am the fruit of adult education. It's really within my roots. Not just thinking about the education of youth and adults, but I would like to bring to this talk not only my own perspective, but what's happening in the world at this point in time. We're in a pandemic, and COVID came and changed our relationships internationally. All our realities were shifted. As much as internet has existed for a long time, it would be unimaginable that we developed this panel, this thoughtfulness before, because the COVID pandemic has really changed our relationships and our situation. Yeah, so something like this really wouldn't have been organized previously, and I really appreciate that. In Brazil, we have 21 million cases of contamination by COVID, over 21 million. We have over 600,000 dead. This is not a joke. We need to think about the prejudice that this has caused for the people of Brazil that are poor and black and subaltern. Our immigrant community is also very large and suffered a lot. Many of these who are older than 30 or 40 years old will come into the education system because they were deprived of basic education when they were younger, especially in rural areas. And people who come from rural areas to São Paulo to try and create life for themselves have to come back to their studies later on in their lives. The majority of our students are women. A really large section of them are women because in Brazil, at home, the woman stays at home and they look after the children. And so many times they are grandmothers before they go back and finish their education. And in the pandemic, it wasn't very different. What changed during the pandemic was that sometimes the matriarchs used to stay with the children of all the community so that the others could go and study. So the education of the youth and the adults was really attacked and destroyed by the pandemic. And the students suffered a lot more. I brought a small presentation to talk a little bit about the history of CIEJA, the campus that we have, and to also talk about the articulation of Paulo Freire's ideas and how it relates to our work. I have here the presentation. There's also a video, and I'd like you to have a little look at this.
Please let me know through the audio of the video if you can hear it. Because the internet is a little bit slow today. I'm going to click on the play, and when the video starts, there will be a voice already to let me know if everything's okay.
Funcionando.
How great that you are here to come to watch this. Despite the distance, we can still celebrate this moment. The school still has not been the same without you, and you have not been the same without our daily relationship. We haven't had any contact, any daily contact, only through messages and videos. We have exchanged poetry, recipes, and much more. We have learned to observe more the cycles of life and to enjoy life. We continue to share bread and to be in solidarity. Next year, Paulo Freire will complete 100 years, and he is the one who reminds us of the necessity of hope. He says we need to have hope, but from the verb of to have hope. If we think of the verb of to wait, which is very similar to hope in Portuguese, the verb to hope means to go after, not to wait and hope for things to be better. We must go forward with things. We must hope and continue and work in a different way. When we look at our garden, I feel this hope because in the pandemic, it's blossomed and it grew and expanded, still being cultivated by many different people. Wind, the sun, all of the cycles of nature. And when we think about water, we also have to think about being like a waterfall. We had to be big despite all of the difficulties, all of the challenges. And just like the water from a waterfall, no one could have stopped us. No one could have stopped our dreams. Just like our students who continued and have graduated. And to them who have graduated and to those who are watching us, remember, the school, the CIEJA will always have open doors for you. And at some point, we will be together and hugging each other.
Esse vídeo, já vou deixar a
Video,
apresentação enquanto
I'll leave it in the presentation for us.
foi feito no ano
This video was made last year,
chegar mais próximo,
and it had the objective of reaching out to the community,
da nossa comunidade,
to have a closeness to our community.
ela era pela conversa e era para manter esse vínculo.
It was to keep an open conversation with the community.
De divulgar cada vez mais o
And it also had the objective of showing how open we are and inviting people in to the school and for people to understand our reality a little bit better. Later, I will talk a little bit more about the project in the city of São Paulo. But right now, I'd like to talk about the center itself. The mission of this CIEJA and most of CIEJAs in São Paulo, the school, is to have different spaces that are not just concrete blocks. Great spaces, public spaces to receive several people. So in this case, it is in the neighborhood of Campo Limpo, but the buildings are adapted to have all of these opened in various spaces. And this is a perspective of allowing people to have a new kind of education, less polluted, to be able to have a dream of going after their education. Thinking a little bit more about São Paulo and adult education, CIEJA means Integrated Center of Adult and Youth Education. This CIEJA here, which is called CIEJA Campo Limpo, the neighborhood, it opened on the 4th of April in 1998. But before this Campo Limpo school, it had a different name. Paulo Freire was the Secretary of Education of São Paulo when he came back from his exile in 81. And he had a proposal of joining people to think about education, especially in youth and adult education. Erugina was another mayor of the city council. They didn't really continue this project after she left. And so there used to be the idea that there was a semi-presential, it was a bit remote, the education that people had. They would only come in once in a while to the school. And at the moment, in our school in Campo Limpo, we have around 1,600 students. We have 160 students with some kind of disability. We also have over 200 students who are in assisted freedom. They have a policy of open doors.
São encontros de 2 horas e 15. A gente tem
every shift are 2 hours and 15 minutes, so there are 6 shifts in total throughout the day.
Como eu falei para vocês, né, em todos os espaços, toda a sala de aula, no caso que seja
When I told you that every space, every classroom is shared, it is because no one learns by themselves. The idea is that there is a dialogue, that there is a sharing between the students. So there's also lots of workshops. We have classrooms with several workshops with differentiated activities. We have lots of classrooms with a different organization of tables and chairs. And this is all helping the students to have a conversation and an open dialogue with each other. We also have a final presentation at the end of the cycle. During the pandemic, things worked a little bit differently. We also have field trips, cultural and formative field trips. We go to cultural institutes. We go to indigenous communities. So we visit lots of different places. We can see actually some of the places that these people have visited very far away. We also have a part of the curriculum that discusses anti-racism in the school. And we have lots of people who contribute, who are graduates who are doing postgraduates, or they're doing doctorates, who are involved in the school's community. We had one of the biggest encounter with indigenous people. This was before the pandemic. The Guarani tribe came, and in a month, they were able to see what this community is like. We have a lot of partnerships with NGOs, with different people who bring in diverse projects in the city of São Paulo, and they bring a different approach to the school. And it's a pleasure to receive them at the school.
Começou graças a uma pessoa bem bacana que foi a Milena, né? Já tinha antes isso, mas foi na gestão dela.
Pandemic, there already was this kinds of discussion, but this person, CIEJA, brought this really cool person, this openness to talk about municipal education, to become a formative group within the city. So CIEJA used to come together, and all the CIEJA groups would come together and work together. And there was an event, which in 2019 brought together all the CIEJAs of the city. And in 2020, we published our first book, which tells the story of the 27 CIEJAs in the state of São Paulo. And for me, it's incredibly revolutionary how these CIEJAs talked about their own trajectories, their own histories, and they had the autonomy. It was amazing how they wrote this book. And we published in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic. It was a real, conquest for us, for all the CIEJAs, all the different campuses in the city of São Paulo. So we can talk more about this story. This is a digital book, so if you want to look for it online, it's there. Look at the CIEJAs in the city of São Paulo. It's a really, really cool book. There's a little map here, shows where the CIEJAs are within the city. It's very cool, you can see. When they published book, they showed this map so that you could see where all the different places are. Fran is going to speak now a little bit about CIEJA, and Fran and I are the representatives of the Paulo Freire side of these CIEJA schools. A little bit about the pandemic in Brazil.
Faltam 2 minutinhos, tá bom?
Sorry to interrupt you, Diego. You only have 2 minutes left of your time. Okay, he says. Okay, thank you, guys. I'm just wrapping up. In the pandemic, it was really cool that we instrumentalize these people. We produce a lot of cultural events in the CIEJA. These are the 2 live events. These are 2 of the live events CIEJA produced, as you can see on this slide. And now we obviously have the return to the schools, and that was really, really important moment. Let's think about the discussion of Paulo Freire in the peripheries of São Paulo. Now, I think what's important about Paulo Freire is that he worked with excluded populations through the speech and the dialogue. And I think it's really important to look to the peripheries and to work with the subaltern groups to bring Paulo Freire's legacy forward. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass on to Fran. You have a few minutes now. That's enough of me for now. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Diego. You've left enough time. Don't worry about it. Thank you again. Thank you. Really wonderful. And now we have a better idea of what it is you're talking about to bring this transactional education to really, hit the nail on the head. And we really, really need to share these projects, to share these ideas, and to really push it forwards. Thank you very, very much. So now, to continue, I'm going to hear from Professor Franciele Busico Lima. She is a doctorate in the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism in the University of São Paulo. She's a master in aesthetics and art. And she also has her undergrad in history from FFLH. She's also a teacher from the ULG. She works as a general coordinator at the Integrated Center of Youth and Adults, which is the CIEJA we have been talking about, since 2016. She's professor of the course in pedagogy at the institution Singularidades since 2002. The talk is titled Education as a Practice of Speaking with Brazilians, a Collective Fight. Thank you very much, Juliana. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with you guys tonight to meet with Sonia and Diego, who are very, very close and warm colleague friends of mine. And so CIEJA is a really important thing for our neighborhood. Thank you as well for Isa and Josh for doing the translation. Isa took part of the network, and we're very proud of the CIEJA network. So good afternoon to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for listening to me. I'm going to take on what Diego has said and work with it. It's actually quite difficult to speak after Diego and Sonia. They've spoken so eloquently. A really sensational talk from Sonia. Thank you. Talking about the importance of the movement of Paulo Freire and this whole city. Diego has already talked about the history of the CIEJA. So I'm going to speak specifically about the CIEJA Perus, which is a specific CIEJA. I've got this little presentation for you guys, and then maybe we'll dialogue a little bit, have a time for some questions and a bit of conversation. And really, make the most out of this wonderful panel and discussion together. So I'm not going to speak just about my experience, but about a collective experience about CIEJA Perus. It was inaugurated in 2016 And Campo Limpo was where the first one was, and we learned a lot from the first one. And CIEJA Perus is the most recent, the little baby of the city that was only recently inaugurated, and is the next step in our history. As you can imagine, São Paulo is huge, and for those who don't know it, São Paulo has, I think, about 13 million people within the metropolitan region, and we have a huge diversity of regions and peoples, and Perus is in the northeast of São Paulo, and I will show you more or less where it is in a second. What I'd like to say is with all the CIEJAs in São Paulo, it's not enough to break this inequality, this systemic lack of civil and human rights, which, you know, the people really deserve. It's a historical necessity, and with these 16 sections, we aim to further this cause. And we work really hard to ensure all the rights of all the people that take part in our CIEJA groups who study in our centers. We also have different forums, different fronts of where we fight the injustice and the inequality, and we have a lot of these discussions about why it's important that the education for youth and adults isn't sectioned off, and that it's a fight for everyone together, by everyone together, collectively. And we really need to intention our collective and public power so that everyone can study at whatever stage of their lives. So what we have as a singular characteristic of CIEJA Perus, we have a huge migrant population. So Sonia was saying about Paulo Freire. For who does he fight? And I'm going to speak a little bit using his phrase. He says, for those who are exiled in the world, and for those who are discovering themselves, and those who are suffering, but I work with them and I fight for them. And we can never forget, as Paulo Freire said, that we're not going to focus on the suffering, we're going to focus on building together, work against the inequality, the injustice in our country. So let me tell you a bit about the territory of Perus, where it is. It's there's a lot of struggling in this territory for historic rights. It's in the northeast of São Paulo, as I said, and it's a neighborhood with a very, very intense immigration policy. Lots of people from the state of Minas, lots of people from the urban areas of São Paulo. But there's a really intense immigration from Haiti.
We are right here. Geographers, please do forgive me, but it looks like a dog's head. Here we have the neck and the right ear. Jacena, there is the north region of São Paulo, and here it is the northwest of the city. And so it is very far away. It's almost on the outskirts of São Paulo. And so we're almost falling off of the map. We're right on the fringe as this community is. It has a small space. It only has 24 square kilometers, but it is a population that does not stop growing. Got about 80,187 people. We didn't have this counting in 2020, but we imagine that there are about 180 1,002 people in this neighborhood, which is very big. And this is because of the intense migratory movements in this neighborhood as well. I said that it is a territory that has had a lot of struggles and fights. And the biggest one that is known throughout all of Brazil was the strike in this cement factory, which was one of the biggest in Brazil. So it is a symbol of resistance. And we have a lot of conversations and study groups, field trips with our students there in front of the cement factory. So it can become a center of memory and resistance for all of the workers. And in Peru's, we have a sad history with the dictatorship. There are many burials and graves there in the cemetery of people who were tortured and murdered by the military governments. So that is something that marks the cemetery in this region. Here is our school in the Russo Garden area. This is the front of the building. The CIEJA CUBS was not a home like most of other schools are. It was a rented building. It used to be a private school in the neighborhood that went broke. And then this allowed this building to be rented. So it does already look like a formal school. It has a formal structure, but we were able to take away this idea of this structured, very formal school. And we tried to keep something a little bit more informal, something that strays away from traditional structure. This yellow gate here at the front is always open. All the classrooms are always open. And this is very important for all the students in the whole community. At the moment, these are our data. We have about 1,500 students enrolled in the school, 49 students with some kind of disability. We have over 900 students that are migrants, Haitian migrants, and about 500 students that are Brazilian. So just by looking at this approximate number of students, you can see that the migrant population is bigger than the Brazilian population. This is one of the schools that has the most number of migrants enrolled in a school, in a public school in Brazil. And so it tries to guarantee in a collective manner some ideologies and ideas and missions. We have a leadership that is not exactly linear, it's more horizontal, there's always communication to guarantee the three functions of adult and youth education, which are foreseen in the national curriculum, which is to repair, to equalize, to be equalitarian, and to qualify different people, people with disabilities, adults, the elderly, and migrants. So thinking a bit about the perspective of Freire's ideas, we work with generating concepts. We work in a group with the students in culture groups, what we call. They're not very squared lessons. So we try to have a different format for the classrooms. There's a lot of dialogue, a lot of debates. We believe that the analysis of the students' reality can unleash a production of knowledge that is much more important to them, and also that talks between different subjects. So this is some of the teaching that we do. We go through areas of knowledge rather than the knowledge itself. And also maintain a relationship between popular knowledge and scientific knowledge. So we try not to allow people to believe that because they've arrived at this school, they don't know anything. On the contrary, we tell them that they have a lot of knowledge and a lot of understanding of the world. And we're there to construct this popular knowledge together with the scientific knowledge. And she says, we also have to build knowledge together with the students. There's a lot that we can learn from them as well. And so we have lots of movements that take part in lots of different activities. And we will go back to them after the pandemic because things will go back to normal. Here we can see some of the walks that we did as a group. We did a circle group with different students. We were asking to ask for better conditions for women. We did lots of walks throughout the city to call for better working conditions. So
we need to deconstruct this space that's not a classroom. It's really important that it looks like it. Offices as well. And we have these areas of knowledge expansion where we talk about the stories of life, the stories of immigration that people bring, these women bring to these centers for discussion. And we support each other. And it's really important they bring their differences, whether they come from the Northeast or from Haiti. And so they bring their life stories so that we can bring them back into the education system so they can study again. But principally for women, people with special needs, different languages. We work with everybody. Here we have our attempt to do bilingual menus, to create a very Haitian menu for people so they can feel at home, to present a community and a culture for Brazilians, but also from those from the outside. And here we have a moment of celebration, which is the first Brazil-Haitian party that we had. And we presented all this dance and food and culture and the richness of this culture, this delicious Haitian food for also the Brazilian students, so we could share. And we never have just a party for Brazilians or for Haitians or Brazilian culture or Haitian culture. We combine them, we bring everyone together, and we hope. Last year, of course, we did it online, this party, but we were very much looking forward to reactivate these parties in real life, with everyone coming together physically as well. There's so much beauty in this art, and this culture, and the people that come and bring different cultural heritages to the table. It makes us breathe and come out of ourselves from the place where we are. We need it to really bring ourselves out of states of depression. And there's the forró, of course, which is a very important Brazilian music. And here we have some Haitian students putting on the Haitian funk music for everyone to dance as well. It's a really, really special moment. And we really hope to come back to this experience after a couple of years of having done it all online because of the pandemic. So here we have this girl Sarah who's reading a Criollo poem, and we have poems in various different languages. We have different studies. We really work with multilingualism. There's these meetings, these reunions where people can speak in their language and to converse in their own cultures, in their own dialects. Using interpreters to help and to share knowledge. So the school is a lot more than just your average school. That tries to fulfill the demands of all the different networks and all the different people in a general sense. So I'm not sure if I've spoken more than I need to, but I'm here. Thank you very much for listening to me. And I hope that everyone who's in Brazil or anyone who wants to come to Brazil can give us a visit sometime and we can continue this conversation here. I'm really honoured to have been able to come and being able to share a little bit of the history of our centres. It's a constant struggle, and it's been built with many hands. It's impossible to be in one of these places thinking that I'm going to take these decisions independently and do these things by myself. Everyone is very together, and yeah, it's so great that for the past 5 years it's been going so well. We've been able to organize ourselves and create the system of education and to forward the guarantee of basic human rights that these people need. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Everyone together. It's really lovely ideas. So thank you. Yes, that's the idea. So thank you for the dialogue. So now I'm going to pass over to Regiane Ferreira, who is going to talk about the questions. So now, Regi, it's over to you. It's a real pleasure to hear everyone speaking. Really fantastic. So we have a few questions. And so starting with Sonia, who's the first speaker, two questions for her. The first was by Clara Araújo. She asked, good afternoon.
O que você consegue visualizar como progresso na forma de inclusão no debate das minorias dentro dele?
Okay, so in your long career, what can you see is a form of progress in the education institutions of Brazil? The second was a question by Rosana Teixeira.
Muitas pessoas associam as problemáticas e alguns resultados da escola pública de nosso país a Paulo.
Do you associate some of the problems of the current Brazilian system to the impact of Paulo Freire? Could you talk a little bit about the current attribution that Paulo Freire has in the education system in Brazil? Okay, you can speak. So I want the first question to be repeated. In your experience of the public education system, what do you see as progressive or a progression in the inclusion of minorities in the debate about education? And there's a third question that will go to Diego.
Tudo bem.
Okay. Yeah. Another question from Rosana. The youth are migrating more and more to Asia. This reflects something about our education system, but more specifically, CIEJA being the education for youth and adults, the system that we've been looking at. What does this mean in the context of Brazil? So the idea that CIEJA is a multilingual school, as you said, is about realizing inclusion effectively beyond the language, beyond individual languages. What was the biggest obstacle for this inclusive approach? And what were the policies that you brought to bear on this issue? If you have any questions about the questions, I can repeat myself. So Sonia says she can start. I'm going to start with Rosana's question that asks, Paulo Freire is the patron of Brazilian education. All the failures of Brazilian education have been attributed to him, without a doubt. This happens all the time. People don't understand that Paulo Freire was elected as the patron of education because he had a huge contribution to the Brazilian education across his entire trajectory, his life, all the books he published, all the works that he did, all the spaces that he created. And these people believe that the patron is the person that writes the educational policies, and I believe that he should have done that, and that should be the way things work, but that's not how it works. Not even the most progressive governments have this kind of system. So the MEC, which is the Brazilian government of education, really demonized Paulo Freire after a while. He had an educational proposal. He had an educational proposal, and it's claimed that his proposal took Brazil towards communism. And this script stuck. Even when Paulo Freire came back to Brazil after the dictatorship, there was this reluctance to accept him because of communism.
Unicamp's director, the university, had invited Paulo Freire to go and work there. And he asked people, what do you think about inviting Paulo Freire to come and teach here? And another teacher wrote a letter, a very beautiful letter actually, and said, wait a second, it's not the university who should ask if Paulo Freire is good enough to come to university and teach. We have to ask our educators if the university is dignified enough to receive Paulo Freire and not the other way around. And so this showed how much Paulo Freire was exceptional. But there was, with no doubt about it, I work at the Institute Paulo Freire, and I receive people from many different places in the world who wanted to know Paulo Freire. And they wanted to understand the ideas, they wanted to learn about the library. But it wasn't very pleasurable when it was a group of students. They would say, we have one teacher who is a big fan of Paulo Freire, but it's how they used to say. And they introduced Paulo Freire to us. So we are here today to know more about it. And this teacher showed to us the ideas of Paulo Freire. So we know that we do have Paulo Freire teachers. And so much so that these students, they come with a practice and with a conversation that is very different to other students who are in contact with Paulo Freire. And sometimes there are teachers who work with dialogue and participation, like Paulo Freire used to, just like with this methodology that is used. But many universities do not work with Paulo Freire. They do not teach his methodology. So it is a mistake to talk about Brazil's failure in education and pinning it on Paulo Freire. The failure of Brazil is the lack of investment, the lack of training teachers, a lack of public policy that does not finance enough education. There is no priority for education in Brazil. So this is where comes failure. There is no investments. There are no decent textbooks. There are no conditions that guarantee that teachers can develop their profession, that have the support of the governments. So this is the failure in education. So thinking of Paulo Freire as the patron of education, it was brought by a congresswoman for Paulo Freire to occupy the role of the patron of education, to orient teachers in education. But this did not exactly happen. But the law, although it is in the law, it doesn't happen in real life. Although he is the patron in the law, it is not seen like that in reality. When Paulo Freire was Secretary of Education, he managed to make beautiful projects for the population with many different aspects and different perspectives of education, valuing the professionals of education. When he was in the role of Secretary of Education, it was really worked and developed to guarantee and look again at the curriculum and reestablish it, thinking about the training for teachers as well. And we have to think about politics, policies from the government and not state policies. And we are always resisting, we are always fighting, just as other CIEJAs are doing, other centers of education are doing. And it is possible to have a differentiated education, even though there is a lack of investments. We must fight to have more investments and more resources for the governments to be more engaged in this fight. But despite that, when we have an organized group and we have a will to change things, and we have a political will to change things, things will change. I think maybe there might have been something missing from the questions, but that's about it. Can I join in? Yes. So trying to be a bit quick. To be a bit quick with my answer. I think that the CIEJA can be seen through different prisms, through different places and perspectives. First, we have to understand that there is a juvenile process of the CIEJA, younger people who are joining the CIEJA. It is not adequate that there are much older people and then much younger people coming in. So what happens in the public schools? This kid is troublesome. That kid gives me too much trouble. And this kid is also already getting old. He's already 16. You know what? After he's 15, they're going to be invited to leave the school. And that's when they go into the CIEJA. And so this is what's happening between the regular education going into adult and youth education. And so even though they are in regular education, they will be thrown out and they are forced to go into the adult institutions when they're 16, 17 years old. Yeah, they're not part of the age that is appropriate for that grade, for that year group. And so that's when they sort of push them out of the school and they go into CIEJA. And it is very contradictory because then when he goes into the CIEJA, he is also complaining as well. And they say, we have a educational proposition. Are you willing to take part in it? Some of them see the open gates and they ask, can I actually leave? Are you sure? And this is part of their educational proposition. But can I really go out to go and have a snack? I can go to the library whenever I want to. And so there is a conception of education and regular education that is kind of like a prison. There is a idea of school as a prison. Another perspective is that many times these young people, they are obligated to leave school to support their families because their father is unemployed or he goes to ask for money on the streets or he goes to work at the markets and they don't have time to study. And then they arrive at school when they're 20, when they're 21, or sometimes they can get a girl pregnant and they have a child at a very young age and they don't have time to go back to study. And so their responsibilities are different. And they see as school as something that is not exactly necessary. And they actually need money and they have to work to rent a house and to support their family. And we have a fourth perspective.
So this fourth perspective is the young person goes back to the school because he feels like he's lost out. He's missed a couple of years, and he stays with this perspective of having missed out. And I think this is probably the fourth most important perspective. So we've heard about various situations, various perspectives, and then one turns to another and he says, I want to hit you. And it's difficult to live with these situations. And so we created a group of young people to work on these issues, to ask themselves, how do we face these things? How do we work with them? And they turn and they say, we don't like to, converse about these things. We really want to have a strong dialogue about these things. So at the beginning, the youth started to kick up a huge kerfuffle in the school, and this the leader turned around and said, "Well, what is it would you like in the school?" And they said, "Nothing." And so we asked, "Are you sure there's nothing that you'd want?" And then we allowed them the space so to do nothing. We gave them a space, a terrace, which that they could do exactly what they wanted and have a bit of liberty. And it's a really special space where we give the space to these youths and these adults to be themselves. Just one more, which was a violent case, and just to talk about that a little bit. I'm without a shirt, and imagine my hand coming out the shirt. Imagine this youth that his hand was different. At the end of this project, we had a circle, and he was doing lots of bad things, but then he confessed to the group, and And it turned out that the disfigured hand that he had been broken by the police. The police had crushed his hand and stamped on it, and this traumatic experience brought him so much shame in his process of education. It was really precarious because of the shame that he felt, because of the internalized violence that he had suffered. And he brought this really powerful testimony. He said, look, when I was trying to be the guy, this is what society did with me. So in order to finish, I'm going to talk about the migrant aspect and the difficulty with language, which is a really difficult aspect. We work with Google Translate and all the tools that we can get our hands on to do everything that we can, everything that's possible. Trying to learn a bit of French, and we've been breaking down these linguistic barriers. But there's also these racial barriers, these racist issues that come up. And it's really important to make that part of the curriculum, to deal with these things face on. And the victims often don't understand. They need to we need to really conscientize people about what the different racial minorities in these groups suffer. It's really difficult to come to Brazil and find yourself discriminated against and a minority group. And this was a really important debate for our school, for everyone in the school. You'd be like, oh, what are they doing here? Why are they looking for our jobs and stuff? There's a constant questioning. And in these meetings, it was really important to face up against these prejudices and these misconceptions. So we've tried to integrate people as much as possible within our teams, within the education process, within the culture of education, within health and well-being, within democratic side of participation, these health networks, and the Haitian community has specific demands and they need specific help. But we've really collaborated with the local government to deal with the huge immigrant population that we have and to work with them. And it's a real big difficulty. But it's incredibly difficult, for example, to matriculate someone who has a migrant background. It doesn't fit, with the bureaucracy of Brazilians. They have the identity number, and that doesn't fit. And the Brazilian bureaucracy is very square, and it doesn't work, and it moves very slowly. So the actualization of this process is really important, and fitting people in is really important. So, as they say in Brazil, we do what we can, and we make things work. And so if we can't do it like this, we'll do it like this. Mm-hmm. And yeah, if your number doesn't fit, then we'll stick a extra zero there, and we'll make it work with the system. But it's all about collective work with the staff of CIEJA and with our partnerships. And that's what's really important, is collaborating with everyone in the city, and especially those in the northeast, which is where we are, or with other organizations, NGOs, public sectors, non-public sectors, the Center of Reference for Immigrants, other charity organizations that work in the area in Brazil. Because when we're doing this work, we need everybody. It's not possible to do all these things by ourselves. And we keep asking, we keep talking with the local government and saying, look, well, this is really important. You really need to send us the money and help us out and help us deal with these things. So we really need to, you know, run after and get our things. We need to arm ourselves and arm ourselves for this struggle, for this fight. The important thing is to have a general change of menu, to bank these new individuals and to grow our community. And it's really important to have a specific menu. So we're going to fight a lot for this because the community deserves it. They can't, you know, and families can't just keep having one meal a week, and we really need to get them their dues. Anyway.
Gente, muito obrigada. Eu estou emocionada. Eu acho que não só eu. É um presente ter a fala de vocês. E é um chacoalhão, né? A gente precisa estar ali, porque quem não tá vendo essa realidade todo dia, não pode deixar essa realidade de lado, coisas que você não pensa, né? Então, estamos aqui sempre para lembrar que isso existe, essa realidade está aí, e é preciso lutar e fazer esse trabalho coletivo, porque, de novo, sozinhos a gente não chega em lugar nenhum, e como vocês falaram, né? 16 centros para uma cidade como São Paulo, de 12 a 13 milhões de pessoas. Então, agradeço muito, me sinto muito honrada por estar mediando essa mesa. E eu também agradeço a Isa Fiore, agradeço o Josh Mazas pela tradução que eles fizeram e que ajudou a gente levar mais da nossa cultura para outras pessoas. Eu agradeço ao suporte do Alexandre da Trindade, que está ali, também ele faz parte do CLAREC, é presidente da CUBS. Eu agradeço a Regiane Ferreira por todo o suporte. E eu agradeço também a todos vocês que vieram assistir a essa mesa, a somar e a disseminar o legado do Freire, né? Então, muito obrigada e luta.
É isso aí.
Muito obrigado, gente. Foi um prazer acompanhar vocês. Eu acho que traz o Brasil para cá, as condições do nosso país, as condições do nosso povo. Então, acho que ontem um evento com o pessoal da Rede Emancipa, agora com vocês, eu acho que construir isso gera transformação também, porque a gente sabe como influencia, né, o nosso país e a nossa gente, as nossas perspectivas. Então, agradecemos demais, agradeço a Juliana que insistiu para a gente, né, e ficou com vocês aí, achando uma data aí, porque eu sei que a agenda de vocês assim, é incrível, né, a quantidade de coisas que vocês realizam, a gente fica assim, admirado demais. Então, muito agradecido mesmo, porque é um trabalho voluntário, assim, a gente sabe, numa agenda muito complicada. Obrigado, Ju, por ter conseguido viabilizar e vocês três por ter dedicado o tempo, precioso tempo de vocês aqui. Muito obrigado mesmo.
Nós que agradecemos.
Isso. Muito obrigada.
Muito obrigado.
Prazer.
Tchau, tchau, Diego, Sônia, Franci.
Valeu.
Tchau, tchau.
Obrigada, gente. Beijo enorme para todos.
Obrigada.
Paulo Freire presente.
Sempre.
Quem quiser salvar o chat aí para depois ter todos os links, não esquece, salva o chat. Então,